When Dean laughed and declared his ex was just a friend, I stopped arguing. I simply smiled, replied, "Okay," and accepted the offer that erased me from his life. He thought he won a petty kitchen argument. He did not know he lost the woman holding his future together. By the time he understood the price of that word, my name was off our lease. His business deal was shattered, and the ex he kept had abandoned him too. My name is Violet Holmes. I am 34 years old, and I make my living dismantling things that no longer work. As a senior contract restructuring specialist at Alder Row Advisory in Charlotte, North Carolina. My daily routine involves looking at broken agreements, finding the hidden liabilities, and cleanly severing the ties that bind companies to sinking ships. I am exceptionally good at my job. I am pragmatic, highly observant, and deeply allergic to bad investments. I know how to spot a deficit from a mile away. Yet, for almost 3 years, I lived with a man who was quietly bankrupting my emotional reserves, and I let him do it under the guise of being understanding. His name was Dean Calloway. Dean worked as a brand development consultant for high-end service projects at Bramwell Hospitality Studio. He possessed a gift for aesthetics and a silver tongue that could smooth over any rough, unpleasant surface, to the outside world, and for a long time to me. He projected an aura of grounded maturity. He always knew exactly what to say to make any valid concern feel like a minor, almost embarrassing overreaction. Dean had a terrifying talent for making you feel like you were the one being completely unreasonable, simply by lowering his voice and adopting the gentle, patronizing tone of a disappointed therapist. Then there was Maren Sloan. Maren was the owner of a boutique agency called Hallow Street Design. She was also Dean's ex-girlfriend. She was the lingering, invisible third resident in our shared apartment, though she took up far more space than any ghost ever could. Maren texted Dean almost every single day. There were late-night video calls when she felt overwhelmed, sudden requests for intricate business advice, and frantic pleas for his physical presence during what she constantly described as her absolute hardest times. In the beginning, I tried my hardest to be fair. I prided myself on being a modern, secure, independent woman. I absolutely refused to be categorized as the stereotypical, irrationally jealous girlfriend who forbade her partner from speaking to women from his past. Dean capitalized heavily on that pride. Whenever I expressed even mild discomfort about Maren's constant, looming presence in our daily lives, he would use that perfectly measured, calm voice of his to lecture me. He would explain how mature adults handled friendships with their former partners. He made it sound progressive. He made it sound like an elevated state of emotional intelligence that I simply needed to evolve into. But the boundaries simply did not exist. The small, mundane details began to pile up, slowly suffocating the life out of our relationship. It was never one massive, undeniable betrayal. It was 1,000 tiny, daily paper cuts. The hurt became an ordinary part of my routine. I clearly remember a Tuesday evening in late autumn. I had spent 2 hours roasting a chicken, a rare night where neither of us had to work late and we could just be a quiet couple. We had barely sat down at the dining table. The red wine just poured into our glasses, when his phone lit up on the counter. Maren was freaking out over a vendor dispute for a minor project. Dean did not just text her back to say he was busy. He stood up, took his plate to the kitchen island, and spent 45 minutes talking her off a ledge. My carefully prepared dinner turned cold and congealed on the table, while I sat there listening to him murmur soothing words into the receiver. He apologized later, of course, but the apology felt like a polite, rehearsed formality, not a genuine expression of regret. Then there was our anniversary weekend trip. We had planned a getaway to the mountains for 2 entire months. I had blocked out the weekend on my calendar, turning off my work phone notifications, which was a massive rarity in my demanding line of work. On Thursday night, just hours before we were supposed to pack, Dean came into the bedroom with a tense, apologetic smile. He told me we had to delay leaving until Saturday afternoon. Maren had a critical pitch presentation on Friday morning. and she desperately needed him to run through the presentation slides with her. He said she was on the verge of a total panic attack, and he could not, in good conscience, abandon a close friend in need, when I quietly pointed out that he was abandoning our long-standing anniversary plans instead. He sighed heavily. He looked at me with a mixture of profound pity and exhaustion, as if I were a child who did not understand how the real world worked. That was the worst part of it all. Dean never bothered to hide his emotional prioritization of Marin. He wore his steadfast loyalty to her like a noble badge of honor. More infuriatingly, he treated my discomfort not as a valid feeling or a natural reaction to his neglect, but as a deep character flaw that I desperately needed to correct. He would say things like, "I thought you were more secure in yourself than this, Violet," or, "I really hope we can eventually get to a place where you do not feel so threatened by platonic support." He weaponized my earnest desire to be a good, understanding partner, turning my own empathy into a cage. He was essentially telling me that to be worthy of his love, I had to be perfectly fine with perpetually taking second place in his emotional hierarchy. The fracture finally cracked wide open on a completely ordinary Thursday night. We were in the kitchen of the expensive apartment we rented together. I was wiping down the granite countertops with a damp sponge, methodically cleaning away the crumbs from dinner. Dean was leaning casually against the stainless steel refrigerator, swirling a small glass of bourbon in his hand. It started as a light, casual discussion about our upcoming schedules for the month. I took a deep, steadying breath. I kept my voice perfectly level, meticulously stripping away any hint of accusation or anger. I asked him, simply and directly, if he could establish a bit more distance from Marin. I calmly explained that her constant, manufactured emergencies were bleeding heavily into our private time, that I felt like there were 3 people actively participating in our relationship. Dean did not get angry. He did not stiffen or try to defend himself. Instead, he simply laughed. It was a short, breathy chuckle, the exact kind of laugh you give to a naive child who has just asked a silly, inconsequential question. He leaned his head back against the refrigerator door, took a slow, deliberate sip of his amber drink, and delivered the sentence that irrevocably altered the entire trajectory of my life. "I am not cutting contact with my ex," he said. His tone dripped with a condescending finality, completely dismissing everything I had just shared. "She is just a friend." I stopped wiping the counter. I left the sponge resting on the wet granite. I stood completely still and I looked at him. I really looked at him. Perhaps clearly for the very first time in 3 years. I saw the smug, relaxed set of his shoulders. I saw the absolute, unshakable certainty in his eyes that he had just won this minor interaction. He fully expected me to sigh, drop my shoulders, and walk away in defeated silence, just as I had done a dozen times before. He expected the argument to be definitively over. He thought his logic was flawless, and my emotions were an inconvenience he had successfully managed. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice a single decibel. I did not throw the damp sponge at his chest. Instead, I felt a profound, chilling clarity wash over my entire body. It was the exact same clinical, detached feeling I experience when I look at a bloated, toxic corporate contract and realize the only viable solution is to terminate it entirely. All the emotional noise, all the years of trying to be the understanding girlfriend, simply vanished into thin air. I held his gaze for a few long, silent seconds. Then, I offered him a small, perfectly empty smile. "Okay," I said quietly. Dean smiled back, visibly relieved, taking another victorious sip of his bourbon. He thought my single word was a white flag. He thought it was my final surrender. He thought I was finally accepting my subordinate place in his neatly arranged, self-serving world. He had absolutely no idea that okay was not an agreement. It was a receipt. It was the exact, precise moment I stopped being his supportive partner and started becoming the cold, calculating architect of my own exit strategy. That was the very second I began, quietly and systematically, to erase myself from his future. Exactly 12 months before that night in the kitchen, I received a phone call that should have been a massive turning point in my life. A prestigious crisis management team in Seattle wanted to bring me on board. The compensation package they offered included a base salary increase of 40%, a number that would have completely changed my financial trajectory. I brought it up over Sunday morning coffee, my chest tight with a mix of eager anticipation and nervous anxiety. Dean did not congratulate me. He did not ask about the details of the role. He simply poured his coffee, looked out the kitchen window, and softly explained why the timing was absolutely terrible. He told me he could not possibly leave Charlotte right now when Marin was trying so desperately to revive her struggling design business. He framed his presence in her life as a temporary civic duty, a moral obligation he simply could not shirk. And I, desperately wanting to be the supportive, reasonable partner of a supposedly honorable man, let the deadline for the life-changing offer quietly expire. 6 months passed. A second offer materialized from the same coast, this one even more lucrative. They were dangling a guaranteed profit-sharing clause on top of a massive signing bonus, the kind of money that could have secured my early retirement. I approached the conversation differently this time, presenting the job as a joint victory for our household. Dean's tactics immediately shifted. He did not explicitly say, "Do not go." Instead, he painted a breathtaking, hypnotic watercolor of a future right here in North Carolina. He talked endlessly about how we were on the verge of buying a house together, perhaps a beautiful townhouse with a small garden. He spoke in warm, heavy tones about how we were about to finally settle down and enter the absolute best phase of our lives. He made Seattle sound cold, isolated, and incredibly selfish. When I tried to gently point out that his reluctance to move always seemed inextricably tied to Marin's geographic proximity, he performed his favorite psychological magic trick. He smoothly inverted the entire narrative. "Why do you let her affect your confidence so much?" he asked, his voice dripping with a thick, synthetic concern. "This is really an issue about your self-esteem, Violet. You are constantly projecting your own deep-seated insecurities onto a perfectly innocent, platonic friendship." He was masterful at making me feel entirely unhinged. He was so convincing, so unbothered and steady, that I would walk away from those arguments genuinely wondering if I truly was the paranoid, controlling villain of his story. But the people who truly knew me saw the grotesque imbalance clearly. My best friend, Celia Barrett, sat across from me over lunch one rainy afternoon, watching my phone screen light up with yet another canceled dinner reservation because Dean had to rush over to Marin's studio for an emergency. Celia did not mince her words. She pointed out that Dean was not merely maintaining polite, cordial relations with a former partner. He was actively and consistently giving Marin a level of emotional priority and raw devotion that I had never fully experienced in our entire relationship. Celia noted that I got the practical, boring version of Dean, the man who paid half the utility bills and bought the groceries, while Marin got the passionate, fiercely protective Dean who would drop everything at a moment's notice to save her. My younger brother, Miles Holmes, was even more brutally blunt. During a loud family barbecue, after watching Dean spend 45 minutes pacing the front lawn on a hushed phone call with Marin, Miles cornered me by the grill. "He loves this setup," Miles said, handing me a clean plate. "Do you honestly not see it? He is completely addicted to the feeling of being needed by two different women at the exact same time. He is feeding his massive ego by keeping you infinitely patient and keeping her completely dependent. It is a disgusting power trip, Violet, and you are funding it." I stubbornly defended Dean to both of them. I defended him because he had never given me the easy, undeniable way out. There was no cheap perfume on his collar. There were no mysterious hotel charges on our joint credit card statements or secret burner phones hidden in the glove compartment. There was absolutely no concrete, undeniable proof of physical infidelity, which made it virtually impossible to point a finger and say he was definitively a cheater. There was only the slow, agonizing erosion of my self-worth, built upon hundreds of isolated instances where I was placed firmly in second place behind a text that read, "Marin needs me right now." Marin herself ensured the dynamic remained agonizingly blurred and impossible to navigate. She was an absolute expert at hovering right on the edge of the boundary line without ever technically crossing into overt, undeniable proposition. She would regularly send him text messages that were half joking, but laced with a deeply unsettling intimacy. She still casually referred to him by an old, private nickname they had shared 5 years ago, once, while Dean was in the shower and his tablet was illuminated on the bed sheets. I saw a message pop up on the lock screen. It was a mirror selfie of her wearing a deep emerald evening dress, standing in a brightly lit boutique fitting room. The caption underneath it read, "Does your taste still run the same as it used to?" Dean brushed it off immediately, claiming Marin was just being quirky and seeking harmless fashion advice for a gala. I swallowed the thick bile rising in my throat, forced a tight smile, and nodded. That was the exact day I started keeping the ledger. I bought a small, unassuming black notebook and hid it in the bottom drawer of my home office desk, buried under stacks of old tax returns. I did not start recording things to build a vindictive case for a dramatic, screaming confrontation. I did it to preserve my own fragile sanity. I desperately needed tangible, written proof that I was not completely losing my mind. Every single time a date night was canceled, I wrote down the date, the time, and the exact excuse he gave. Every time his phone rang after 11 at night and he took the call locked in the guest bathroom, I logged the duration of the conversation. Every time a weekend trip was truncated or a personal milestone of mine was completely overshadowed by her latest manufactured professional crisis, it went straight into the book. After 3 months of diligent record-keeping, the pages were dense with blue ink. Looking at the sheer volume of data, the undeniable, mathematical pattern of my own daily erasure was utterly terrifying. It was cold, hard empirical evidence of a profoundly one-sided compromise. I was bleeding myself dry to water his ego. It was precisely in the middle of this quiet, agonizing internal reckoning that a third opportunity arrived, landing in my corporate inbox like a heavy lifeline thrown into a freezing, turbulent ocean. Northreach Recovery Group, a massive, industry-leading firm based out of Seattle, wanted me to spearhead and lead an entirely new department dedicated solely to high-stakes corporate restructuring. It was not just another job offer, it was a massive career-defining mandate. The financial compensation was staggering. The executive authority was absolute, and the relocation package generously covered every conceivable expense involved in moving across the country. I sat in the cold, glass-walled office of my current direct superior, listening to him explain the stark reality of the situation. He looked at me with a complex mixture of deep professional respect and visible personal exhaustion. "They want you for this role, Violet," he said, tapping his expensive silver pen rhythmically against the heavy mahogany desk. "But I need to be completely honest with you right now. The partners out in Seattle have been waiting patiently on your hesitation for over a year. This is the 3rd time they have extended their hand to you. They absolutely will not do it a 4th time. You either sign this contract and take this role now, or they close the door permanently and hire someone else by the end of this month." I walked out of his corner office with the freshly printed offer letter feeling incredibly heavy inside my leather briefcase. I knew exactly what Dean would say if I showed it to him that evening. I knew the exact disappointed tone he would use, the exact emotional guilt trip he would deploy about our imaginary future townhouse, and the exact manipulative way he would somehow make my hard-earned ambitions sound like a direct, personal attack on his life stability and Marin's fragile emotional state. The black notebook hidden in my desk drawer had already shown me the unvarnished truth. I had spent nearly 3 years bending, yielding, and making myself smaller and quieter, so that Dean could feel large and Marin could feel completely safe. I had compromised my geography, my career trajectory, and my own peace of mind for a man who would not even set a basic, fundamental boundary regarding a late-night text message. I realized, with a cold and brilliant clarity that started in my chest and spread to my fingertips, that I was entirely out of compromises. The ledger was completely full. The emotional account was drastically overdrawn, and it was finally time to collect my debts. Reed Monroe, my direct managing director at Alder Row, called me into his office at exactly 4 o'clock that afternoon. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind me, sealing off the low hum of the trading floor. Reed did not offer me a seat. He remained standing by his floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the Charlotte skyline before turning to slide a thick, cream-colored folder across his desk. "Northreach is done waiting, Violet," Reed said flatly. "They have held this requisition open for you longer than I have ever seen a Seattle firm hold anything. But their board is meeting on Monday. You either take the seat, or they move to their second choice." I opened the folder. The terms laid out in crisp black ink were staggering. This was no longer just a generous salary bump. It was a formal executive chair. They were offering me the title of Senior Vice President of Restructuring, complete with a signing bonus of $150,000, vesting options, and a clear contractual path to a partnership within 36 months. It was the kind of career elevation that fundamentally rewrites a person's life. It was power. It was undeniable autonomy. "I need an answer by tomorrow morning," Reed told me, his tone stripping away our usual friendly banter. "Do not let your personal life sink a lifeboat this big." I left the office with the folder burning a hole in my leather tote bag. That evening was my anniversary with Dean. We had been together for exactly 3 years. I had planned the entire evening with meticulous, almost desperate precision. It was supposed to be the night I laid all the cards on the table. I intended to present the Seattle offer, not as a point of contention, but as a final, definitive test of our partnership. I wanted to have one last, deeply serious conversation about our future, our physical location, and the absolute necessity of establishing hard, impenetrable boundaries. I arrived at the apartment early. I spent 2 hours preparing a complex, demanding recipe for braised short ribs, filling the kitchen with the rich, heavy scent of red wine and rosemary. I set the table with our best plates and lit 2 tall, white taper candles. Then, I went into the bedroom and put on the dark emerald silk dress that Dean had once said made me look untouchable. I poured 2 glasses of Cabernet, checked the clock, and waited for him to walk through the door at 7 o'clock, exactly as he had promised. At 7:15, the front door finally clicked open. Dean did not walk in with flowers or an apologetic smile. He walked in with his eyes glued to his phone screen, his thumbs flying rapidly across the keyboard. He kicked the door shut with his heel, barely looking up. "Please do not be mad," were the first words out of his mouth on our anniversary. I felt a cold, familiar stone drop into the bottom of my stomach. "What is going on, Dean?" He finally looked up, running a stressed hand through his perfectly styled hair. "Marin is completely falling apart. She has that massive pitch with the angel investors tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock. And her primary graphics file just corrupted. She is having a full-blown panic attack." "Dean," I said, my voice dangerously soft. "It is our anniversary. Dinner is hot and on the table right now." I know, and I am so sorry," he said, stepping forward to give me a hurried, distracted kiss on the cheek. "I just need 20 minutes. I am going to hop on a quick video call, walk her through the backup recovery protocols, and calm her down, I promise. 20 minutes max, and then the rest of the night is entirely ours." He did not wait for my answer. He grabbed his laptop from his leather briefcase and practically sprinted into the guest bedroom, pulling the door firmly shut behind him. I stood in the center of the kitchen, listening to the muffled, soothing cadence of his voice bleeding through the drywall. 20 minutes slowly ticked by. The candles burned down by an inch. Then 30 minutes passed. I walked over to the stove and turned the burner off under the reduction sauce. 45 minutes. An hour. I sat alone at the beautifully set dining table. I did not touch my wine. Beside my empty plate sat my tablet, the screen illuminated with the digital copy of the Northreach contract. I tapped the screen to keep it from going to sleep. I read every single line of the legal text, absorbing the dense, Protective clauses they had drafted specifically for me. They wanted to protect me. They wanted to invest in me. The contrast was so violent it was almost comical. Here I was, a woman highly sought after by a ruthless corporate entity on the other side of the country, sitting in a silent apartment wearing a silk dress, watching an anniversary dinner turn into cold, unappetizing sludge because my partner was busy doing emotional triage for his ex-girlfriend. For the very first time, the vibrant, demanding future outlined on that bright screen called my name much louder than the dying, pathetic love shivering right in front of me. It took an hour and 35 minutes for the guest room door to finally open. Dean emerged, stretching his arms over his head, looking utterly exhausted but deeply satisfied, like a man who had just finished a grueling but heroic marathon. He walked into the dining area and looked at the congealed food and the burnt-down candles. "I am so incredibly sorry, babe," he sighed, pulling out his chair and sitting down heavily. "We had to rebuild half the presentation deck from scratch, but you understand, right? It is a highly sensitive time for her. She could lose the entire studio if tomorrow goes badly." He picked up his fork and poked at the cold meat. He did not look guilty. He did not look ashamed. He looked like a man expecting to be praised for his endless well of compassion. That specific sentence woke me up from a 3-year slumber. He honestly did not see anything wrong. He fundamentally believed that Marin's professional anxiety was a higher priority than our relationship milestones. He assumed that my role in his life was to be a shock absorber for his bad behavior, an endlessly accommodating void where he could dump his broken promises. He was not maliciously trying to hurt me. He simply did not value me enough to protect me from being hurt. I looked at him, eating the cold dinner I had made, and I felt nothing. No anger, no profound sorrow, just a massive, echoing emptiness. "Eat up," I said simply. "It has been a long night." We went to bed in silence. He fell asleep within 10 minutes, his breathing deep and even, completely unburdened by the wreckage he had just caused. I lay awake, staring at the shadows on the ceiling, listening to the steady rhythm of his chest rising and falling. At 2 o'clock in the morning, I slipped out from under the heavy duvet. The hardwood floor was freezing against my bare feet. I walked into the dark living room, leaving the lights off. I opened my laptop, the harsh blue glow illuminating the dark corners of the room. I opened the email from Reed Monroe. I downloaded the final contract file. I did not weigh the pros and cons. I did not imagine the logistics of packing boxes or breaking a lease. I certainly did not spare a single thought for how Dean would survive in this apartment without me carefully managing his life, using the digital signature tool. I carefully traced my name on the bottom line of the final page. I attached the signed document to a new email, typed a brief, professional note to the Seattle partners, and clicked send. The progress bar zipped across the screen, a tiny digital confirmation that the transaction was complete. I accepted the offer before the sun even had a chance to rise over Charlotte. I did not wake Dean up to discuss it. I did not leave a dramatic note on the pillow. For the very first time in years, I made a massive, life-altering decision without dedicating a single fraction of a second to considering whether it would make the man sleeping in the next room uncomfortable. The sun rose over Charlotte, casting long, pale shadows across the living room floor. I sat on the sofa, drinking a cup of black coffee, feeling completely alien in my own home. I did not walk into the bedroom to pull a single suitcase from the closet. Packing boxes was an emotional, chaotic task reserved for people who were simply running away. I was not running. I was executing a strategic corporate dissolution. I am a restructuring specialist. When a major conglomerate is bleeding capital and failing to meet its obligations, you do not start by rearranging the office furniture or yelling at the board of directors. You start by opening the ledgers. You locate the hidden liabilities, the toxic assets, and the fraudulent projections. I walked into our home office, sat down at the heavy oak desk we shared, and booted up the desktop computer. I began a forensic audit of my own personal life. Dean was notoriously careless with his digital footprint. He possessed the arrogance of a man who firmly believed no one would ever dare to question him. He left his cloud drives logged in and his browser history completely unshielded. I was actively looking for every single administrative thread that quietly tied my identity, my reputation, and my financial security to his ecosystem. It took exactly 45 minutes to uncover the first hidden landmine. Buried deep within an archived folder in his primary email account, I found a communication thread between Dean and a high-end mortgage broker from exactly 3 weeks ago. Attached to the second email in the chain were my complete income verification documents, my tax returns from the previous 2 years, and a detailed summary of my corporate bonus structure. I stared at the screen, reading the text in Dean's message over and over again. We are strongly considering buying a luxury townhouse early in the first quarter of next year, he had written to the broker. Attached are the preliminary financials for both myself and Violet for your initial review. We want to secure pre-approval before we start touring properties next month. I sat perfectly still in the leather office chair, feeling the blood turn to ice in my veins. We had absolutely never agreed to buy a house together. Roughly 4 months ago, while driving past a new upscale residential development, we had vaguely discussed the concept of testing the real estate market. It was a fleeting, hypothetical conversation over a Sunday drive. Yet, Dean had taken that loose, casual assumption, harvested my highly sensitive personal financial data without a single word of consent, and transformed it into tangible transactional leverage. The coldness in my chest spread. I kept digging. The deeper I went into his organized folders, the more the entire illusion of our equal partnership disintegrated into dust. I opened a massive, beautifully designed presentation deck titled for a new boutique hospitality venture in the downtown district. It was a formal pitch file, exactly the kind of document you present to wealthy angel investors and venture capital firms. I bypassed the glossy architectural renders and the slick marketing jargon, scrolling straight down to the financial projection slides. There, boldly listed under the guarantor and primary financial backer section, was my full legal name. Dean's entire risk mitigation strategy depended on my steady corporate income and my credit score of 815. The deck presented us as a power couple, using my professional stability and 6-figure salary as the unspoken foundation of his speculative gamble. He was selling my reliability to strangers to fund his dreams. But the absolute worst detail, the single piece of information that made me physically nauseous and forced me to grip the edge of the desk, was located on slide number 14. It was the comprehensive list of strategic vendors and partners for the hospitality project. Right at the very top of the list, named as the exclusive interior architecture firm holding a lucrative retainer, was Hallow Street Design, Marin's studio. Everything suddenly clicked into place with a horrifying, brilliant clarity. The fog of the last 3 years evaporated instantly. This was no longer just a sad, mundane story about a weak man who lacked appropriate boundaries with a former lover. This was a fully functioning parasitic system. Dean was meticulously building a future where Marin served as his emotional muse, his damsel in distress, and his creative partner. Meanwhile, I was being silently, methodically positioned as the reliable, unsuspecting bankroll to ensure the whole production did not go bankrupt. He was keeping me around to underwrite the exact life he actually wanted to live, hand in hand with someone else. I picked up my cell phone and dialed a number I knew completely by heart. Lena Voss and I had survived the grueling trenches of university together. Now, she was a viciously effective, highly sought-after contract lawyer working for a top-tier firm in downtown Charlotte. "Lena," I said the second she answered the phone, "I need some immediate legal advice, and I need this conversation to stay completely off the official record." "Tell me exactly what is happening," Lena replied, her friendly tone instantly dropping away, replaced by the sharp, focused cadence of a legal shark. I clearly and methodically explained the mortgage broker email, the unauthorized distribution of my tax returns, and the investor pitch deck featuring my name alongside Marin's design firm. I asked her exactly how I could legally untangle myself from corporate and financial documents I had never formally consented to be a part of. "Listen to me very carefully," Lena said, her voice crisp and authoritative over the line. "He cannot legally bind you to a mortgage or a corporate business loan without your wet signature or a verified e-signature. You are currently safe from direct legal debt. However, by circulating your financials to third-party brokers and investors, he is creating a massive and dangerous presumption of involvement. If those investors act on that deck and funnel money into his project believing you are the financial safety net, it will be a monumental headache to prove you are entirely ignorant of the scheme. You need to act immediately, Violet. You have to shut this down before he takes these joint plans any further and actually attempts to forge your consent on a binding term sheet." "I understand," I told her, my voice remarkably steady. "Thank you, Lena. I know exactly what I need to do." "Do you want me to draft a formal cease and desist letter today?" she asked. "I can have a courier drop it at his office by noon." "Not yet," I replied firmly. "I do not want him to know I am even looking at the board until I am completely invisible and off the grid." I hung up the phone, closed the browser tabs, and opened a blank digital notepad on my own encrypted laptop. I did not write a tearful diary entry about my broken heart. I wrote a tactical, corporate withdrawal plan. It was a cold, precise, and unforgiving checklist. Item number 1. Open a completely separate, independent checking and savings account at a different banking institution on the other side of the city. Item number 2. Contact my Human Resources Department to reroute my entire direct deposit starting on the first day of the upcoming month. Item number 3. Log into my corporate portal to update the primary beneficiary on my life insurance policy and my retirement portfolios, erasing Dean's name entirely and replacing it with my brother's name. Item number 4. Discreetly contact the property management company that owned our apartment building to review the exact financial penalties and early termination clauses hidden in our current lease agreement. Item number 5. Change every single password on my personal devices, my cloud services, my banking portals, and my social media accounts. I spent the next 6 hours executing that list with ruthless, mechanical efficiency. I did not shed a single tear. I systematically severed the invisible, dangerous cords one by one. I was actively preparing to vanish from every single structural foundation that Dean Calloway arrogantly took for granted. He honestly thought he was the master architect of our shared lives, dictating the terms and the timeline. He was about to find out, very soon, that I legally owned the ground he was building his little empire upon, and I was quietly, steadily pulling the earth right out from under his feet. I decided to keep my hand entirely hidden. There is a very specific, dangerous kind of clarity that arrives when you finally realize the person sleeping next to you is not your partner, but your liability. I did not confront him about the mortgage emails. I did not scream about the investor deck. I simply smoothed my facial expressions into a mask of placid, agreeable domesticity. I wanted to see exactly how far Dean would push his luck when he firmly believed he still held absolute control over my reality. I wanted to observe the unvarnished truth of his arrogance. Exactly 7 days after I secretly accepted the Seattle offer, Alder Row Advisory hosted an exclusive internal gala at a sleek downtown venue. It was not a casual corporate mixer. It was a formal recognition dinner, and I was slated to receive a heavy glass plaque for single-handedly salvaging a notoriously brutal corporate merger earlier that quarter. It was a pinnacle moment for my professional reputation in Charlotte. Dean had spent the entire month assuring me he would be right by my side, dressed in his tailored charcoal suit, playing the role of the endlessly supportive boyfriend. At 4 o'clock on the afternoon of the gala, I was standing in our bedroom, carefully fastening a silver clasp at the nape of my neck. Dean walked into the room. He was not wearing his suit. He was wearing dark denim jeans and a casual cashmere sweater. He held his phone loosely in his right hand, his face arranged into a practiced mask of deep, exaggerated distress. "I am so incredibly sorry, Violet," he said, stepping toward me with a heavy sigh. "Marin just called in an absolute panic. She is totally freaking out. She has that massive pitch with the new developers tomorrow morning, and her presentation flow is completely broken. She cannot get the narrative right." I turned away from the mirror and looked at him. I did not blink. I did not flinch. "You are going to her studio," I stated softly, keeping my voice perfectly even. "I have to," Dean insisted, raising his hands in a gesture of helpless surrender. "You have to understand, this is a do-or-die opportunity for her. If she bombs this pitch, Hallow Street Design might have to file for bankruptcy by the end of the year. Your firm is just handing out awards tonight. You already won. She is actively drowning. I will try to make it to the venue for dessert. I promise." He kissed my forehead, a dry, perfunctory brush of his lips against my skin, and hurried out the front door. He genuinely believed I would stand there and swallow the disappointment just like I always did. He thought my silence was submission. He did not know my silence was the sound of a judge quietly banging a gavel. I ordered a black car and arrived at the gala alone. Walking into a room filled with my brilliant, high-powered colleagues without my partner should have felt humiliating. Instead, I felt dangerously light. I felt untethered, holding a glass of sparkling water. I navigated the crowded room with a sharp, renewed focus. Fate, it seemed, was entirely on my side that evening. Standing near the expansive floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline was a small cluster of executives. I recognized the lead partner from Northreach Recovery Group immediately. The Seattle team had flown into Charlotte for a separate client meeting and decided to attend our firm's gala as professional courtesy. I walked straight up to them. I did not play the role of the abandoned girlfriend. I played the role of their incoming senior vice president. For the next 2 hours, we stood by the glass, discussing aggressive restructuring tactics, market volatility, and the precise timeline for my transition. I was sharp, articulate, and completely unburdened. Every intelligent point I made, every decisive strategy I outlined, only cemented their absolute certainty that they had poached the perfect shark for their waters. I was actively building my wealthy, secure future right there in the ballroom, while the man who thought he owned me was across town fetching coffee for his ex-girlfriend. Around 9 o'clock, I excused myself to visit the restroom. I locked the heavy wooden door behind me, leaned against the marble counter, and pulled my phone from my clutch. Out of sheer, morbid curiosity, I opened my social media application. At the very top of my feed was a fresh story posted by Dean. It was a photograph taken inside a dimly lit, moody pub. The image showed 2 pint glasses of dark stout beer sitting on a sticky wooden table, illuminated by a neon sign. Marin's delicate, manicured hand rested prominently in the frame, her fingers lightly grazing the base of Dean's glass. The caption scrawled across the bottom in bright white text read, "Big night prep with the original genius." I tapped the screen to view the comments. Marin's close circle of friends had already descended upon the post. One woman wrote, "You two are the absolute dream team." Another commented, "Seriously, when are you guys just going to admit it and get back together already?" I stared at the screen, waiting for the familiar, suffocating wave of jealousy or panic to wash over me. It never came. I only felt a cold, clinical disgust. Dean did not reply to those comments to correct them. Marin did not delete them. He was allowing his public audience to actively disrespect our relationship, completely failing to protect my dignity or my title as his partner. I realized then that I had been fighting to save a ghost. I was guarding an empty house. I closed the application, touched up my red lipstick in the mirror, and walked back out to the party. Dean finally came home a little past midnight. I was already sitting in the dark living room, wrapped in a blanket, watching the city lights flicker outside the window. He walked in smelling faintly of fried food, dark beer, and expensive women's perfume. He dropped his keys onto the console table with a loud clatter and flopped heavily onto the sofa beside me, completely oblivious to the freezing temperature of the room. "We finally cracked it," he announced, exhaling a long, satisfied breath. He looked immensely proud of himself. I swear, Violet, she was completely falling apart when I got there. I had to basically rewrite the entire second half of her financial projections. But I saved the pitch. I really pulled her out of the fire tonight. You would have been proud of how I handled the data." He was looking at me, genuinely expecting me to validate his ego. He wanted me to pat him on the head for being a hero to another woman on the exact night he abandoned me. "I am sure you were very helpful," I replied, my voice smooth and totally devoid of any recognizable emotion. Just as the words left my mouth, my phone vibrated silently in my pocket. I pulled it out and glanced at the glowing screen. It was an official, automated email from the Seattle relocation coordinator. The message contained my finalized flight itinerary, the address of my fully furnished temporary corporate apartment, and the confirmed date I needed to be physically present in the Northreach boardroom to sign my onboarding documents. I had exactly 21 days left in Charlotte, 3 short weeks until I vanished. "So," Dean said, shifting his weight on the cushions and resting his hand on my knee, "how was your little party? Did you get your award?" "I did," I said, locking my phone screen and sliding it back into my pocket. "It was very illuminating." "Good, good," he murmured, his eyes already drifting shut as the exhaustion caught up with him. "Listen, about that townhouse we talked about, I was thinking we should definitely set up a meeting with a realtor right after my big boutique hospitality launch event next month. We need to strike while the market is soft." He kept talking, spinning a grand, elaborate web of a shared future, totally blind to the fact that I had already cut all the strings. He rambled on about square footage, granite countertops, and the neighborhood schools, while his eyes were closed. I opened the web browser on my phone. I navigated to the website of a premium cross-country moving service. I entered the exact cubic footage of my personal belongings. I bypassed the standard packing service and selected the expedited white glove tier. When the calendar menu popped up on the screen, asking for my desired loadout date, I did not hesitate. I selected a Tuesday. It was the exact same Tuesday morning as Dean's highly anticipated boutique hospitality launch, the very project he had fraudulently tied my name to in his investor decks. I typed in my new, entirely separate checking account number and authorized a non-refundable deposit of $2,000. A confirmation screen appeared, locking in the date. I sat there in the quiet dark, listening to the steady, rhythmic sound of Dean breathing next to me, still holding my knee. He was dreaming of his perfectly constructed empire, built entirely on my stolen stability. I simply smiled into the shadows, comfortably watching the invisible ground beneath his feet slowly turn to ash. It was exactly 12 noon on a Tuesday when the ultimate truth arrived. And ironically, it did not come from the man I had lived with for nearly 3 years. It came from the woman he kept hovering in the shadows of our relationship. I was sitting at my desk in the Alder Row advisory office, reviewing a particularly dense severance clause, when my personal cell phone lit up next to my keyboard. The notification displayed Maren Sloan's name. We rarely communicated directly. Our interactions were usually filtered entirely through Dean, so seeing her name on my screen sent a sharp jolt of adrenaline through my chest. I unlocked the screen and opened the message. "Hi, Violet," the text read. "I just wanted to reach out and formally say thank you so much for being so incredibly cool and supporting our boutique hospitality project. Dean told me you reviewed the final financial deck last night and gave us your absolute blessing. It really means the world to me to have you in our corner." I stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. I stared at the glowing pixels, reading the words 4 times to ensure my mind was not playing tricks on me. I had not seen any financial deck last night. Last night, Dean had fallen asleep on the sofa watching a basketball game while I quietly packed my winter coats into a duffel bag in the spare bedroom. A lesser woman, or perhaps simply a woman who had not already spent weeks meticulously plotting her exit, would have immediately called Maren and screamed. She would have called Dean and demanded an explanation. But I was operating on a completely different frequency now. I was a corporate investigator staring at a prime piece of evidence. I needed to see exactly how deep this lie went. I took a slow, deep breath, intentionally relaxing the muscles in my shoulders. I typed my response with slow, deliberate keystrokes, keeping my tone breezily casual. "Of course, I replied. It is a massive undertaking. Remind me, are you guys still looking at that specific property in the Arts District we talked about? I threw out the Arts District as a complete guess, a bait to see what she would offer. Her response came through less than a minute later, completely oblivious to the trap I had just set. Actually, we are focusing on the downtown block near the river. Marin wrote back. Dean said you guys are totally pausing your townhouse hunt so he can funnel his liquid capital into this launch, which is so generous of you. By the way, he told me you officially turned down that massive Seattle job because you wanted to stay here and prioritize him. I know things have been really tough for you two lately, basically living like roommates with your crazy work schedule, but he really appreciates you not leaving him hanging. I locked my phone and placed it face down on the cool mahogany wood of my desk. The silence in my office felt suddenly deafening. Dean was not just a coward who could not set boundaries. He was a master architect of alternate realities. He was standing in the center of a stage, holding two completely different scripts, handing one to me and one to Marin. He had actively convinced her that I knew about the investor deck. Worse, he had manipulated my actual career trajectory, telling her I rejected the Northreach Recovery Group offer out of sheer devotion to him. But the most chilling detail was the word roommate. He was managing Marin's expectations by painting our relationship as a dead, passionless arrangement. He was feeding her the narrative of a tragic, trapped man who was only staying with me out of financial convenience and habit, making Marin feel like she was his true soulmate waiting patiently in the wings. He used my name to secure his funding, and he used the lie of our failing romance to secure Marin's unwavering emotional devotion. It was a carefully balanced system of manipulation. 3 days later, the physical evidence finally caught up with the digital lies. I was at the grocery store on a Sunday afternoon when my brother, Miles, called me. He did not say hello. He sounded breathless and furious. I am standing across the street from that new luxury development on Oakwood Avenue, Miles said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. Dean is here, and he is not alone. Marin, I stated, pulling my shopping cart out of the main aisle. Yes, Miles hissed. They are doing a walkthrough with a real estate agent, Violet. They look like they are buying the place together. I am watching him right now. My phone vibrated against my ear. Miles had sent a photograph. I pulled the device away and opened the image. It was taken from a distance, slightly grainy from the digital zoom, but the subjects were undeniable. Dean and Marin were standing on the front steps of a sleek, modern townhouse. The real estate agent was unlocking the front door. Dean's right hand was resting heavily, intimately, on the lowest part of Marin's spine. He was guiding her forward, his body leaning into hers in a way that aggressively shattered the illusion of a platonic friendship. It was the possessive, familiar touch of a lover. Did you get the photo? Miles asked, his voice shaking with anger. Tell me you are finally going to leave this guy. Let me drive over there right now and confront him. Miles, listen to me very carefully, I commanded, my voice dropping into the absolute zero temperature I used during hostile corporate takeovers. Do not approach them. Do not let him see you. Go get your coffee. Go home. And do absolutely nothing. I have everything completely under control. I hung up the phone before he could argue. I zoomed in on the photograph. I did not look at Dean's hand. I looked at the glossy white sign planted in the perfectly manicured front lawn. It had the name and direct phone number of the listing agent. I stepped out of the grocery store, walked to my car, and dialed the number. When the agent answered, I introduced myself cheerfully as Violet Holmes, Dean Calloway's partner. Oh, Violet, it is so wonderful to finally speak with you, the agent gushed, completely falling for my bright, friendly tone. Dean speaks about you constantly. We just finished touring the Oakwood property. It is an absolute dream. I am so glad, I said smoothly. My work schedule has been brutal lately, so Dean has been handling the heavy lifting. I just wanted to touch base regarding the timeline for the paperwork. Absolutely, the agent replied eagerly. Dean mentioned you would be joining him to co-sign the primary mortgage application just as soon as you finish up a few internal corporate procedures at Alder Row. We have the pre-approval ready to execute the second you are available to provide your physical signature." "That is exactly what I needed to know," I said, a terrifying smile spreading across my face in the empty parking lot. "Thank you so much for your hard work." I ended the call. Dean was actively parading Marin around as his domestic partner to fulfill his romantic fantasies, while simultaneously promising the real estate agent that my pristine credit score would arrive shortly to foot the actual bill. I drove straight to Lena Voss's law firm. We sat in her corner office for 3 hours, drafting a brutal, impenetrable legal shield. It was a formal, notarized affidavit of non-involvement. The document explicitly stated, in uncompromising legal terminology, that I had never authorized Dean Calloway to utilize my income, my credit profile, my corporate standing, or my personal likeness in any real estate transaction, business venture, or financial application. It severed me from him with surgical precision as I signed the bottom of the document, stamping it with the heavy seal of the notary. A strange realization washed over me. For the first time in 3 years, I was not angry at Marin Sloan. She was exhausting, she lacked boundaries, and she was entirely complicit in blurring the lines. But looking at the grand, twisted architecture of Dean's lies, I realized Marin was just another asset he was managing. She was being fed a carefully constructed fantasy, just like I was. She truly believed I was the cold, distant roommate standing in the way of their true love, totally unaware that Dean was actively trying to trap my name onto a 30-year mortgage. Her ambiguity did not excuse her behavior, but it recontextualized it. We were both just playing the roles Dean had written for us. I folded the heavy legal document and slid it into my leather bag. The board was completely set. I had the job in Seattle. I had the moving truck secured. I had the legal documentation to destroy his financial leverage. The only thing left to decide was the exact moment of execution. If I revealed my hand too early, Dean would have time to pivot, to invent a new lie, to manipulate the investors before the ink dried. If I waited too long, my name could actually be dragged into a fraudulent term sheet. I needed to strike at the absolute apex of his arrogance. I needed to let him build his fragile house of cards as high as it could possibly go, right up until the very morning he needed it to stand the most. Then, and only then, would I casually pull out the bottom card and watch his entire world collapse. Exactly 18 days before my flight was scheduled to depart from Charlotte, the weather finally broke. Leaving the city air thick and stifling, I stood in the center of our impeccably decorated kitchen. The overhead pendant lights cast a sharp, unforgiving glow across the white marble island. I placed 2 distinct pieces of paper side by side on the cold stone surface. On the left was the formally executed employment contract from Northreach Recovery Group, complete with my start date in Seattle prominently printed at the top. On the right was the legally binding notice of non-renewal for our current apartment lease, officially stamped by the Property Management Office. Dean walked through the front door at 6:15 in the evening. He dropped his leather briefcase by the console table, loosened his silk tie with a weary sigh, and headed straight for the kitchen to pour himself a glass of sparkling water. He did not immediately register the documents. He took a long sip from his glass, leaned his hip against the counter, and finally looked down. I watched his eyes scan the heavy black text. I observed the precise moment his brain attempted to process the information and completely miscategorized it, because I had spent nearly 3 years yielding to his preferences. Dean possessed an unwavering, deeply ingrained belief that my boundaries were entirely theoretical. He genuinely thought this was a theatrical cry for attention. A slow, patronizing half-smile spread across his handsome face. He picked up the lease cancellation notice, letting it flutter casually between his fingers, and then tossed it back onto the marble. "Okay, Violet," Dean said, his voice dripping with familiar condescension. "How long are you planning to keep this up?" I had a brutal day dealing with the design vendors, and I do not have the energy for a dramatic standoff tonight. I did not cross my arms. I did not raise my chin in defiance. I kept my posture entirely relaxed, my hands resting loosely on the edge of the island. I am not acting in a movie, Dean, I replied, my voice holding the calm, flat cadence of a bank teller confirming a deposit. I have officially signed the executive offer. I have successfully scheduled the transition handover with my current managing director. I have already secured a fully furnished corporate apartment in downtown Seattle. I will be permanently vacating this unit on the exact date printed on that notice. Dean stared at me. The smug, condescending smile physically died on his face, slowly melting away to reveal a stark, unvarnished confusion. He searched my eyes, desperately looking for the familiar flicker of hesitation, the underlying plea for him to stop me. He found absolutely nothing but empty, unyielding stone. When the reality of the situation finally penetrated his towering arrogance, his expression morphed violently. The color drained completely from his cheeks, leaving his skin a pale, sickly shade of gray. His posture stiffened, the casual slouch vanishing as pure panic flooded his nervous system. Then, the panic rapidly calcified into a defensive, blazing anger. "Are you completely out of your mind?" Dean demanded, his voice cracking slightly as the volume spiked. He slammed his glass down onto the counter. "You accepted a job across the country. You canceled the lease on our home. How could you possibly dare to make a massive, life-altering decision like this without having one single conversation with me?" The absolute hypocrisy of his outrage hung heavily in the quiet kitchen. I looked at the man who had secretly packaged my financial security to fund a life with his former girlfriend, and I felt a profound sense of peace. The surgical precision of this moment was intoxicating. I made my decision the exact same way you independently decided that your former girlfriend was infinitely more important than every single boundary I ever tried to set, I answered, my tone razor-sharp and perfectly level. Dean flinched as if I had physically struck him across the jaw. He took a step back, his eyes darting frantically around the room, desperately trying to locate an alternate angle of attack. When his authority failed, he immediately pivoted to his favorite weapon, moral superiority. He tried to steer the entire narrative toward my supposed character flaws. "This is incredibly cruel. Violet," he spat, his chest heaving. "This is a ridiculously impulsive, vindictive stunt. You are literally destroying our entire shared future. You are throwing away 3 years of an amazing partnership, all because you harbor this insane, irrational jealousy over an old, platonic friendship. You are punishing me because I happen to be a decent, supportive person." I did not take the bait. I did not engage in a messy, emotional debate about who loved whom more. I stepped directly into the space he was trying to dominate and laid out the cold, undeniable inventory of his deception. "Do not insult my intelligence by mentioning our shared future," I said softly, stepping closer to the island. "I know exactly what you did with my income statements. I know you forwarded my private tax returns to a mortgage broker 3 weeks ago to secure a loan I never agreed to. I know you are actively shopping for a townhouse on Oakwood Avenue. I also know you embedded my name and my credit profile into a formal pitch deck to secure venture capital for a boutique hospitality project." Dean stopped breathing. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. The righteous anger instantly evaporated, replaced by the sheer, naked terror of a cornered animal. "And most importantly," I continued, maintaining relentless eye contact, "I know that the primary design partner listed in that exact same financial deck is Hallow Street Design. For 3 entire years, I allowed you to convince me that my discomfort was a personal failing. I listened to you preach about maturity while you repeatedly abandoned our relationship to prioritize Marin. I now understand that you were never just a supportive friend. You were actively utilizing my professional stability to underwrite a fantasy life you wanted to build with someone else." For the very first time since I met him, Dean Calloway was completely stripped of his silver tongue. He could not deploy his soft, patronizing voice to gaslight me. He could not invert the narrative to make me the villain, because the empirical data was sitting firmly on the table between us. His carefully constructed parallel universes had violently collided. He frantically changed his tactics. The arrogance vanished, instantly replaced by a desperate, cloying panic. He reached out across the marble island, attempting to grab my hands, but I smoothly pulled them back out of his reach. "Violet, please, you have to listen to me," Dean begged, his voice dropping into a frantic, pleading register. "You are completely misinterpreting the documents. The project was for us. The house was supposed to be a surprise for us. I can fix this. We can sit down tonight and establish entirely new boundaries. I swear to you. Marin is just a temporary blip. She is just a distraction during a highly stressful period. I will cut her off completely tomorrow morning if that is what you want. Just please, cancel the flight." He was bargaining with someone who was already gone. He was offering to sacrifice the woman he actually prioritized, simply to retain the financial and domestic infrastructure I provided. It was the most pathetic display of self-preservation I had ever witnessed. I looked at him. Really looked at the frantic, sweating man standing in the designer kitchen, my salary paid for, and I delivered the final, fatal blow to his illusion. "You are not afraid of losing me, Dean," I said, my voice dropping to a low, freezing whisper. "You are terribly afraid of losing the incredibly convenient, fully funded system you constructed around me." Dean froze. The frantic energy drained out of his body, leaving him hollow and utterly defeated. He looked down at the marble countertop, his shoulders slumping under the crushing weight of exposure. From that exact moment onward, the dynamic fundamentally shifted. Dean finally understood that his words held absolutely zero currency. There was no apology articulate enough, no promise grand enough, and no manipulation subtle enough to patch the massive hole I had just blown through the center of his life. He was no longer dealing with a girlfriend he could manage. He was dealing with a creditor who was permanently closing his account. I landed in Washington State on a Tuesday morning. The air coming off Puget Sound was crisp, carrying a sharp, clean bite that immediately cleared the lingering suffocation of North Carolina from my lungs. I spent my first 48 hours in Seattle meeting my new executive team at Northreach Recovery Group, executing the physical handover protocols, and officially signing the lease for a stunning, high-rise corporate apartment. Standing in the center of that massive glass living room, looking out over the dark, churning water of the bay, a profound realization washed over me. For 3 entire years, I had actively folded myself into a tiny, silent square just so Dean could comfortably occupy the rest of the room. I had starved my own ambition to feed his ego, constantly shrinking my presence to accommodate his sprawling, chaotic needs. Out here, with the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean stretching out beyond the glass, I finally had the space to breathe and stretch to my full height, while I was establishing my new empire across the country. Dean immediately launched a frantic, aggressive public relations campaign back in Charlotte. My best friend, Celia, kept me quietly updated over the phone during my evening commutes. Dean was playing the exhausted, heartbroken victim to anyone who would listen. He sat at the corner tables of our usual downtown dinner spots, nursing dark beers and telling our mutual friends that I had abruptly abandoned him because I simply could not handle his basic, human kindness toward an old friend. He spun a tragic narrative of my deep-seated insecurity, painting himself as the honorable, patient man who was cruelly punished for merely being a decent pillar of support. But a narrative built entirely on smoke can only hold its shape until the wind blows. The first major gust arrived on a Thursday afternoon in the form of a direct email to my secure corporate inbox. The sender was Nolan Pierce, the lead angel investor Dean had been aggressively courting for his boutique hospitality project. Nolan was a notoriously shrewd financial operator, a man who built his wealth by spotting inconsistencies in a ledger. And he did not mince words. "Dear Violet," the message read, "Dean mentioned during our preliminary phone call this morning that you are unexpectedly withdrawing your foundational support from the downtown venture. We were under the strict impression that you two were building a unified future together and that your corporate stability was the primary guarantor for the initial capital loan. Could you please clarify your sudden change in position? I sat at my new mahogany desk, reading the words with a cold, clinical satisfaction. Dean was actively trying to spin my departure as a minor, temporary setback, attempting to manually patch the massive hole in his financial credibility without revealing that the entire foundation was a fraud. I hit reply and typed a response that was brutally short, meticulously polite, and legally bulletproof. Dear Mr. Pierce, there has been a significant miscommunication regarding my involvement. I have never agreed to participate in this venture, nor have I ever authorized anyone to offer my personal or professional finances as a guarantee for this project. Please update your investment records immediately to reflect that I am completely unaffiliated with Dean Calloway and his business endeavors. Wishing you the best of luck. I clicked send. I knew exactly what would happen the second that email landed in Nolan's inbox. An investor of his caliber does not simply shrug off a blatant misrepresentation of collateral. Nolan and his finance team would immediately pump the brakes. They would look at Dean's glossy presentation folders and realize that he had shamelessly leveraged a personal relationship as a soft asset to artificially inflate his own credibility. The trust, which was the absolute currency of the hospitality business, was instantaneously shattered. Meanwhile, the collateral damage of my departure was spreading rapidly to the woman Dean had fought so hard to keep. As I would later learn through the tangled web of Charlotte's professional network, the timeline of my exit had finally forced Marin to open her eyes to the reality of her own position. After I left, Marin had demanded to see the real estate communications I had referenced during the final fallout. She read the exact dates and the specific, highly committed language Dean had used with the mortgage broker and the realtor. The dates directly overlapped with the exact weeks Dean had been sitting on her studio couch, swearing to her that he and I were barely speaking and living entirely separate lives. She realized with sickening clarity that Dean had completely lied to her about his level of commitment to me. He was actively shopping for a permanent home with me while promising her that our relationship was drawing its final breaths, driven by a sudden, terrifying suspicion. Marin had gone back through her own phone. She scrolled through 3 years of text messages, reading them without the rose-tinted glasses of his charm. She finally saw the glaring, repetitive pattern. Every single time she had pulled slightly away, tired of being the secret priority, Dean had fed her the exact same line. He would tell her that things with me were on the absolute brink of ending, keeping her suspended in a permanent state of vague, hopeful anticipation. He was keeping her hungry, throwing her just enough emotional scraps to ensure she never actually moved on and found a real partner. But the final, fatal blow to Marin's delusion had nothing to do with me at all. While stopping by the apartment to help Dean pack up his home office later that week, she had glanced at his unlocked tablet resting on the kitchen island. She found an active, heavily flirtatious message thread between Dean and a wealthy, prominent female client of her own design studio. The messages were filled with the exact same charming, attentive tone he used on Marin. He was actively manufacturing a brand new emotional triangle before the dust from the old one had even settled. It was the ultimate, undeniable proof. Dean was not a tragic romantic torn between two great loves. He was a power addict. The love triangles, the constant manufactured crises, the endless need for multiple women to rely on him for emotional and professional support. It was all just a toxic, deeply ingrained habit of control. He needed to be the sun, and he needed a constantly rotating cast of planets orbiting around him to feel warm and significant. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my Seattle apartment, holding a ceramic mug of hot green tea. The city lights were beginning to reflect off the dark water of the bay, painting streaks of gold and silver across the waves. I felt an incredible, overwhelming sense of lightness, as if a heavy, leaden coat had been lifted from my shoulders. 3,000 miles away, in a half-empty apartment in North Carolina, Dean was finally running out of places to hide. His investors were pulling back, demanding hard answers he could not legally provide. The woman he had used to fund his life was gone, and the woman he had kept on the side had finally seen the ugly, unvarnished truth behind his charming smile. For the first time in his entire life, Dean Calloway was realizing the most terrifying truth of all. He was no longer the author of the story, and he had completely lost control of the narrator. I returned to Charlotte exactly 2 weeks later. The cross-country flight was not a rescue mission. I was there strictly to pack the final, essential boxes of my winter wardrobe, sign the ultimate termination papers with my lawyer, Lena, and say a proper goodbye to Celia and my brother. When I unlocked the door to our old apartment, the space was already hollowed out by the moving company, echoing with a sterile emptiness. Yet, standing in the center of the living room, Dean had desperately attempted to stage a romantic renaissance. A massive bouquet of white lilies sat on the kitchen island next to an open bottle of very expensive Cabernet. 2 crystal glasses caught the dim light. Dean was waiting there, wearing a crisp white button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up, looking perfectly disheveled, like a romantic lead in the final act of a movie preparing his grand apology. He immediately launched into his heavily rehearsed monologue. "Violet, thank God you are here," he began, his voice dripping with practiced vulnerability. He took a cautious step forward, his hands raised in a gesture of total surrender. "I have spent every single hour since you left tearing my own mind apart. You were absolutely right. About everything." I leaned against the doorframe, keeping my coat on, and let him speak. "It was Maureen," he continued, shaking his head with a look of profound disgust. "She completely manipulated my sense of loyalty. She clung to me, Violet, every time I tried to pull away and focus entirely on us. She manufactured a new, inescapable crisis. She played on my guilt. I simply did not know how to cut her off nicely without completely destroying her. But she is gone now. I blocked her number this morning. We can start over. Right now. Just the 2 of us." He looked at me, waiting for the tears to fall, waiting for the emotional collapse that would signal my ultimate forgiveness. I walked over to the marble island. I did not touch the wine. I opened my leather tote bag and pulled out a thick manila folder. Without breaking eye contact, I began laying the documents flat on the cold stone surface, one by one. First, the printed email to the mortgage broker containing my private tax returns. Second, the financial guarantor page from his boutique hospitality pitch deck prominently featuring my name. Third, the official confirmation from the real estate agent regarding the townhouse. Finally, the notarized legal affidavit of non-involvement drafted by Lena. "You did not keep Marin around because you were too nice," I said, my voice completely devoid of warmth. "And you did not use my financial identity because you were confused. You built a system. You just got caught managing the assets." Dean stared down at the papers. The romantic, remorseful facade shattered instantly. His jaw tightened, and the charming polish completely burned away, leaving behind a cornered, furious man. "I was trying to build an empire for us," he snapped, his voice echoing sharply in the empty room. He slammed his hand onto the marble. "That venture, that townhouse, all of it was for our shared future anyway. Why are you punishing me for trying to secure a massive life for both of us? I just needed to borrow your credibility for a few months to get it off the ground." He had just handed me the absolute confirmation. He slipped up, in his mind. My consent was never an actual requirement. It was a guaranteed, automatic default. He viewed me as a resource, not a partner. Before I could even respond to that staggering display of entitlement, a sharp, heavy knock echoed from the front door. Dean froze. I turned and pulled the door open. Marin Sloane was standing in the hallway. She looked exhausted, her usual immaculate styling replaced by a messy ponytail and a sharp, furious light in her eyes. She brushed right past me without a single word of greeting and walked directly up to the kitchen island. She did not look like a woman fighting to win back a man. She looked like a woman who had just discovered she was the punchline of a very long, very cruel joke. "Marin, what on earth are you doing here?" Dean hissed, his panic spiking to a frantic, breathless pitch. "You need to leave. Right now." Marin ignored him completely. She reached into her designer purse and slammed her own stack of papers down right next to mine. She also pulled out her smartphone and slammed it onto the counter. "He told you I was manipulating him," Marin asked me. Her voice trembling with a potent mixture of rage and humiliation. She pointed a shaking finger directly at Dean's chest. "Ask him what he told me last Tuesday night." I looked at her, then down at the papers. They were printed screenshots of text messages. Marin unlocked her phone, opened an audio file, and pressed play. Dean's hushed, intimate voice filled the empty kitchen. "I just need to extract my investments from Violet's accounts before I can safely leave her." The recording of Dean whispered, "Once I escape this dead relationship, I promise you will have a massive equity role in the new hospitality project. It is always going to be you. Marin." Dean stepped back, his face turning the color of wet ash. "Marin, stop. You stole those recordings. You are taking everything entirely out of context." I pulled out a bar stool and sat down. Marin took the stool next to me. For the very first time. We were not ghosts haunting each other's lives. We were two women sitting shoulder to shoulder, looking at the exact same blueprint of a con artist. Did he ever use the phrase, "You are the only person in the world who truly understands the immense pressure I am under"? I asked Marin quietly. Marin let out a harsh, bitter laugh. Almost every single week, usually right before he asked me to design another complex presentation deck for his investors completely for free. He used that exact same line on me whenever he needed me to cover his half of the apartment rent so he could afford to buy expensive networking dinners. I replied, tracing the sharp edge of my legal affidavit with my index finger. We sat there for 20 minutes, dismantling his entire constructed reality piece by piece. We laid our timelines side by side. We discovered that on the exact night he told me he had to rush to her studio to save her from a severe panic attack, he had actually texted her saying he desperately needed an excuse to get out of the house because I was acting completely unhinged and controlling. He had used the exact same tone, the exact same empty promises, and the exact same emotional manipulation tactics on both of us. He simply swapped our names to fit whatever narrative served his immediate financial or ego-driven agenda. Dean stopped trying to interrupt. He stood backed against the stainless steel refrigerator, utterly silent, watching his carefully segregated worlds violently collide and burn to the ground right in his own kitchen. I did not yell. I did not throw the crystal wine glass against the wall. The anger had burned itself out weeks ago, leaving behind a cold, highly efficient machinery. I stood up and pulled a black pen from my bag. I signed the final release form for the apartment lease, pressing the ink firmly into the paper. I slid my 2 silver apartment keys across the marble counter toward him. "Lena filed the injunction this morning," I told Dean, keeping my voice perfectly professional. "Your mortgage broker and the real estate agency have been formally notified of my total non-involvement. Your financial leverage is officially gone." I turned to Marin. She was staring at Dean with absolute, unvarnished disgust, wiping a single, angry tear from her cheek. I did not offer her a hug. We were not friends, and her past complicity was still a fact, but we were finally free of the exact same cage. I picked up my bag and walked toward the door. I did not look back at the man I had spent 3 years loving. I simply walked out, leaving him standing in the middle of a barren apartment, surrounded by his own exposed lies, trapped with the ex-girlfriend he could no longer control. However, the most significant knot in this entire ordeal remained completely intact. Dean still possessed an arrogant, desperate glimmer of hope. Tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock, he was scheduled to host the final, decisive breakfast meeting with Nolan Pierce and the primary venture capital investors. Dean firmly believed he could still deploy his charm to talk his way out of the financial discrepancy. He genuinely believed he could still save his project. He had absolutely no idea what was actually waiting for him at that breakfast table. At 7 o'clock the next morning, Dean Calloway put on his best-tailored navy suit. He stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his silk tie, undoubtedly practicing his most charming, persuasive smile. He still clung to the arrogant delusion that he could talk his way out of the disaster I had left in his kitchen. He firmly believed he could spin the narrative, charm Nolan Pierce, and somehow salvage the massive capital loan for his boutique hospitality project. He genuinely thought his clever words could fix a fundamentally shattered foundation. He had absolutely no idea that I had woken up at 4 o'clock in the morning. I left Charlotte in complete and utter silence, rolling my single suitcase to the waiting black car while the city streets were still dark. Even before my transport pulled up to the airport drop-off zone, I had already completed the ultimate, decisive phase of my departure plan. Using my mobile connection, I sent the notarized legal affidavit of non-involvement directly to Nolan Pierce, his entire financial underwriting team, and the Oakwood Avenue mortgage broker. The digital timestamps on those emails were the exact moments my single word of compliance from weeks ago finally detonated. The critical breakfast meeting was scheduled for 8 o'clock at a high-end private dining club downtown. According to what my friend Celia later relayed to me through her extensive corporate network, Dean walked into that room expecting a celebratory handshake and a signed term sheet. Instead, he walked directly into a financial firing squad. Nolan Pierce did not stand up to greet him. Nolan sat at the head of the long mahogany table, flanked by 2 strictly professional financial analysts. The printed copies of my legal affidavit were already resting face up on the table right next to the silver coffee carafes. "Good morning, Dean," Nolan began, his voice devoid of any standard business warmth. "We are not here to celebrate a launch today. We are here to ask a very direct question regarding the massive, glaring discrepancy between the financial guarantor documents you submitted and the sworn legal affidavit we received this morning from Violet Holmes explicitly denying any financial responsibility for this venture." Before Dean could even attempt to deploy his usual soft, patronizing tone to explain it away as a simple domestic misunderstanding, the lead underwriter from the mortgage brokerage spoke up from the opposite end of the table. "The pre-approval for the Oakwood property is officially completely revoked," the broker stated flatly, crossing her arms over her notepad. "You listed a secondary party on the loan trajectory who never consented and who has now legally barred us from utilizing her credit profile. Your entire borrowing structure is entirely invalid. Dean, we cannot legally proceed with a single cent of this loan." Dean was completely cornered. The color drained from his face as he desperately scrambled to formulate a lie that could bridge the massive canyon between his fabricated projections and cold, hard legal reality. He started stammering, trying to insist that my withdrawal was just a sudden, emotional reaction that he could easily smooth over within a few days. Right at that exact moment, the heavy double doors of the private dining room swung open. Maren Sloan walked in. She was not wearing her usual soft, bohemian-designed studio attire. She wore a sharp-structured black blazer, and her expression was absolutely lethal. She did not look at Dean. She addressed Nolan Pierce directly. "Mr. Pierce, my name is Maren Sloan, owner of Hallow Street Design," she announced, her voice ringing out clearly across the silent room. "I am here to formally and officially withdraw my firm from this project. Furthermore, I need to go on the record and state that Dean Calloway provided my agency with completely fabricated information regarding the financial capacity of this deal, as well as deeply misleading information regarding his personal conflicts of interest. We absolutely will not associate our brand with this level of deception and liability." The chain reaction was instantaneous and utterly devastating. It was a beautiful, symmetrical collapse. The investors immediately closed their thick leather binders. The underwriters stood up, gathered their briefcases, and walked out of the room. Dean's professional credibility, the single most valuable currency in the hospitality industry, evaporated into thin air in less than 20 minutes. I did not have to scream at him. I did not have to stage a public, dramatic meltdown or resort to cheap, dirty revenge tactics. I merely placed the unvarnished truth in the exact right hands at the exact right time, and stepped back to watch gravity do the rest of the work, while his empire was burning to ash on the other side of the country. I was sitting comfortably in a plush leather seat on a direct flight to Seattle. As the plane reached cruising altitude, I connected to the in-flight wireless network. My phone immediately erupted. A relentless barrage of notifications flooded my screen. There were 14 missed calls and over 30 text messages from Dean. I scrolled through them, watching his psychological unraveling documented in real time. First, there were the desperate, pleading apologies. Then, a sharp pivot to aggressive blame, accusing Marin of ruining his life by showing up at the meeting. Finally, he resorted to bitter, vitriolic accusations, typing in all capital letters that I was a vindictive monster who had maliciously destroyed his entire future. I did not reply to a single message. I simply turned off the notifications, put on my noise-canceling headphones, and looked out the small oval window at the endless expanse of blue sky. For the very first time in 3 long years, the silence surrounding me was no longer a terrifying, oppressive force. It was not the heavy, suffocating quiet of a woman constantly biting her tongue to keep the peace. It was the clean, pristine emptiness that remains after a rotten, parasitic weed has been completely uprooted from the soil. 6 months later, I am thriving in my new reality. I have fully settled into my role as senior vice president. I signed a lease on a stunning, sun-drenched apartment overlooking the dark, active waters of Puget Sound. My team respects me immensely for my strategic grit and my absolute, uncompromising precision. I am building a life of immense value, and I do not need to rush into a new romantic relationship to validate my existence or prove to anyone that I won the breakup. My peace is my ultimate victory. The final, pathetic punctuation mark to the entire ordeal arrived yesterday. An email popped into my personal inbox. The sender was Dean Calloway. The subject line read, "Please, just give me 5 minutes to explain everything." I did not feel a single flicker of anger. I did not feel the slightest urge to open the message and read his desperate, manipulative words. I sat at my sleek desk, looking at the bold black text, and I heard the phantom echo of that short, breathy laugh he gave me in our old kitchen. The laugh he gave when he confidently told me he would never cut contact with his ex because she was just a friend. The laugh that arrogantly assumed my boundaries were entirely optional. I hovered my cursor over the delete button. I understood, with total, unwavering clarity, that Dean did not lose me on the day I packed my bags and flew to Washington. He did not lose me when the investors walked out of the dining room. He lost me in the exact fraction of a second he laughed at my self-respect and assumed I would always be there to absorb the impact of his disrespect. I clicked delete and went back to my beautiful life. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. I would absolutely love to know where you are listening from. So please drop your location and your thoughts in the comments section below so we can connect and share our perspectives. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to the Olivia Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and show your support by hitting the hype button so this story can reach and empower even more people.